Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, and I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to look at the Halifax Explosion, but not just the explosion, but what happened in the minutes, hours, and days after the traumatic event, the medical relief that was needed, the people who showed up without being asked. We're also going to look at how this affected Halifax, Canada, and the blind community and the visually impaired. Join me now as we jump into Episode 2, the Halifax Explosion and the medical relief effort. It's December 6th, 1917, early in the morning. The Mont Blanc, a French steamer, sits at McNab Island preparing to leave en route down the Narrows towards Halifax, Nova Scotia. About 20 kilometers on the other side of the Narrows, in Bedford Basin, sits the Emo, the Belgian relief ship. It is also pulling up anchor, about to head towards Halifax as well. Reports of 4 to 5 warning shots were sent off by the Mont Blanc at the Emo to change course as the two ships were coming down the Narrows on the same path. The Mont Blanc was also not flying red flags to signal its true contents as an ammunition ship. It had spent the night at McNab's Island outside of the harbor as an act to protect itself from passing German submarines. It chose not to fly its red flags. The Emo was in a rush from spending the night in Bedford Basin. It was also locked out of the harbor the night before. It was World War I, 3 years deep in, and people were very nervous. If you weren't in the harbor by a certain time, it was closed off for the night as fear of German submarines would enter, so most ships had to spend the night just outside in either Bedford Basin or McNab's Island. The Emo sent off 2 warning shots back, stating it would not change course. The Mont Blanc sent a final warning blast. The Emo quickly responded back, stating again it would not move. The Mont Blanc attempted to turn to port, crossing the bow of the Emo. If you don't know boating terms like me, this means the Mont Blanc turned to the left, crossing the front of the Emo. At this moment, the captain of the Emo orders a full reverse of the ship. The initial damage to the Mont Blanc was not that bad, but the tragedy begins when the barrels on board begin to topple over and leak out all over the deck. These barrels are filled with explosive substance, and when sparks from the 2 ships colliding hit the deck, it ignites instantly. At this point, no one knows the real danger that they are in. All they think is they are watching a couple ships in the harbor fighting over space. The Mont Blanc becomes fully engulfed in flames, and the show becomes an even bigger spectacle. Many of the parts of town and homes look directly down on the harbor. Children walking to school, babies still at home with their moms, men and women off to work, and anyone else with a view stopped to watch. Barrels began flying into the air, exploding and popping as they went. The captain of the Emo ordered his ship to immediately head towards the sea. The crew of the Mont Blanc was told to abandon ship. They all rowed to the Dartmouth shore, where they pleaded with people watching to stop and run for their lives. The problem was, most did not understand their French language. The 39 crew members took shelter in the forest just off of Tufts Cove. The Mont Blanc had drifted into the harbor, stopping at Pier 6 at the end of Richmond Street in the industrial section. More people had gathered to watch as the ship continued to burn, wildly out of control. Little did they know the horror that was soon to follow. A man most of us know, named Vincent Coleman, who worked at the train station, sent off a message saving hundreds of lives that were on an incoming train coming to the harbor. As well, he sent out one of the last messages that would be able to be sent out for hours, as communication would be lost in the area. At 9:04 a.m., as the clock tower shows to this day, at Halifax City Hall, located at 1841 Argyle Street, the Mont Blanc explodes. 5,000 tons of explosives detonate all at once. A shock wave of almost 3,000 tons, traveling at 1,500 meters per second, rips through the town. This is only 5 miles below the speed of sound. The explosion is heard as far away as PEI and Cape Breton. These are about 300 kilometers away. After that, a tidal wave immediately hits Richmond area, 3 city blocks in, at 2.5 kilometers squared. The last part, the explosion pushes a fireball up into the air, filled with hot gases and debris. Once cooled, a giant cloud forms, raining down shrapnel, soot, carbon, and other dangerous substances. Structures in the immediate area, if not wiped out completely, collapsed on themselves, on furnaces, lanterns, stoves, and created structural fires throughout the city. The immediate impact of the explosion affected 325 acres and broke windows as far away as 50 kilometers. The Mont Blanc was blown to bits and only small pieces were ever found. The Emo, it was hit by a shock wave and then a tidal wave, throwing it against Dartmouth shore. The captain and 5 crew members were killed. "9,000 people were injured instantly. That's more than in the war. 1,600 died. 400 more in the coming days. 5,000 to 25,000 were made homeless. 1,600 homes were destroyed, completely flattened to the ground, most of them. 12,000 were damaged and needing repair immediately. This is December in Canada. It is winter time, and there is a snowstorm coming. The damage was estimated at $4 million. Today, this would be around $55 million. Remember everybody watching the Mont Blanc burn out of control? 592 people suffered eye injuries. Most of these people were standing at their windows, watching as the Mont Blanc burned in the harbor below. 48 of these eye injuries were children. 8 of these children were totally blinded after the explosion. 223 bones had been broken. 25 amputations needed to be done. Rail lines in and out of the city were immediately shut down for relief trains only, which unfortunately were delayed due to a snowstorm which brought 40 centimeters of snow that night on a town that had already had enough. A train from Nova Scotia was able to make its way later on in the evening. It brought 11 doctors and a team of nurses. It pulled into Rockingham Station, also carrying Dr. George H. Cox. He was an ear, eye, nose, and throat specialist from New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. He got off the train in the deep snow and walked 6 kilometers to Camp Hill Hospital. Also on that train from Nova Scotia were 4 other eye doctors deserving mention: E. A. Kirkpatrick, E. A. Mathers, A. E. Duval, and A. R. Cunningham. When Dr. Cox arrived at Camp Hill Private Veterans Hospital, it was severely overcrowded. There was 250 beds and 1,500 people there. He immediately realized he would be needed for eye injuries and began writing on linens people's names, address, what they needed for surgery as a makeshift triage as he made his way through the crowds. He saw eyes filled with glass, pottery, brick, nails, and more. People's eyes made noise when they tried to blink. It was awful. Dr. Cox knew he would have to act quickly to save what he could. At another location, known as the VG Hospital, supplies had run dry within the first few hours of the event. Most nurses were overseas helping in the war efforts, so staffing was short. The only anesthesiologist in the hospital at the time was Dr. J. F. Lessell. He was overwhelmed and taught a nurse named Jessie McDonald, class of the 1915 VG nurses, how to administer anesthesia. She was one of the first nurses in Canada to be taught this. Nurses for the first time all over Nova Scotia were granted permission to suture wounds, remove glass, and much more, things they were never allowed to do before. They turned bedsheets into bandages and stepped up wherever they were needed. Evelyn Pemberton, said to be the first registered nurse in Canada, was also on hand at VG Hospital, helping where she was needed. Dr. Cox worked for 40 hours straight at Camp Hill Hospital, operating patient after patient. He took a small 3-hour nap and got up and continued to operate again. He performed 75 inoculations. This is the removal of the entire eye. 5 of these surgeries were double inoculations. All surgeries were done under chloroform, and his instruments were said to have gone dull from all the surgeries he had completed. After receiving the message from Vincent Coleman, 2 trains from Massachusetts arrived on December 8th, 2 days later, due to the snowstorm. On board, the Red Cross, as well as 12 surgeons and 10 nurses. St. Mary's College was taken over and set up as a hospital. Halifax had 4 public hospitals before the explosion. After, it's estimated around 60 hospitals, first aid stations, wound and bandage centers, and anything else that was needed to be set up temporarily. They used ships, schools, the YMCA, and even a tennis club was used. 50 of the townspeople got together the very next day and set up a committee to organize the delivery of furniture, medical supplies, counting the wounded, collecting garbage, repairing windows, and anything else that needed to be done. Later they would be known as the Halifax Relief Committee. A small town 100 kilometers away, known as Truro, had windows said to be broken there as well, had a train incoming with explosion survivors on it from Halifax. These people would not have survived if it would not have been for a brother and sister team, Dr. Avery DeWitt and his sister, Nellie Anderson DeWitt, a nurse. St. John's Ambulance, the Red Cross, the Victorian Order of Nurses, all began setting up wound and bandage stations to help relieve crowding at hospitals. This was the Canadian Red Cross's first involvement in a major disaster. On December 11th, Captain T.F. Took of the Canadian Army from Montreal, and also an EENT specialist, just like Dr. Cox, arrived at Camp Hill Hospital and took over. Dr. Cox returned home to New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. Dr. Took was surprised by the untreated wounds at Camp Hill. Many left to pus over and become septic. He immediately realized he needed to go straight to work. He completed 48 eye operations, 16 inoculations. Side note, the cost of an inoculation back then was $65. Today, it would be about $1,100. Dr. Took was said to try to preserve eyes more when he could, but he also had a little bit more time because he didn't have the pressure that Dr. Cox did with the bombardment of so many patients all at once. Inoculations were often the best option as there was a great fear of infections and the lack of medical supplies available for everyone. The first 2 to 5 days, there was little to no breaks taken by either medical staff or committee members. There was just too much that needed to be done. Medical professionals came from all over Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Montreal, Toronto, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine to help. 387 doctors, 760 nurses, 52 doctors from Halifax alone ran to help in the very beginning, the day before anyone else could arrive. 96 doctors were from the U.S. 30 Canadian Army dental professionals were there. By day 10, December 16th, most people had been treated. Dr. Took returned home to Montreal. Other notable eye doctors that helped: Dr. J.W. Sterling from Montreal, Dr. Harvey from Rhode Island, Dr. Mackenzie and Dr. Goodall, and 4 nurses from Massachusetts. In the days after the blast, shelters were provided by ships in the harbor who had come to help. A local prison opened up its doors to anyone who needed a place to stay. Show & Co. Undertakers, located at 1740 Argyle Street. Today, it is known as a restaurant called Five Fishermen, is claimed to be a very haunted place if you're into that stuff and in the neighborhood. The area known as Richmond, where the explosion took place, is known as the Hydrostone area today. The Anchor from the Mont Blanc, weighing 502 kilograms or 1,140 pounds, flew 4 kilometers, landing just off of Regatta Point, where it sits today at 69 Anchor Drive. A cannon from the Mont Blanc as well, weighing 540 kilograms or 1,200 pounds, flew almost 5 kilometers in the opposite direction, landing in Dartmouth at 171 Albro Lake Road. The next important person in our story is Sir Frederick Fraser. He was the superintendent for the Halifax School for the Blind. He had recently taken over the school before the explosion and was focused on improving the school's education system in order to prepare students for work when they were done. They were taught to read Braille. For women, basketry, cooking, and typing. For the boys, they were taught piano tuning and leather work. He liked to hire teachers who were visually impaired or blind themselves. He was also blind due to an accident as a boy when he was 13. Enrollment at the school was increasing, and overall the school was doing very well. Sir Fraser organized the Blind Relief Fund through the Halifax Relief Committee, which was set up on the second day with the townspeople. The Blind Relief Fund, known as the Halifax Relief Fund, was to cover all medical bills, glasses, and anything else that people injured in the explosion may need. 40 people were completely blinded by the event. 592 eye injuries were reported at the time. By June 1918, 145 claims for artificial eyes had been made and fulfilled by the Halifax Relief Fund. Available at the time for artificial eyes were glass, shells, or even a thin cup-like design, a reform eye, which is said to be thicker glass, or a more modern Snellen version, which is thinner. Pensions were paid out to known survivors. Pensions were from $37 to $94 a month. Today, this would be about $180 to $620 a month. Pensions were funded by the Halifax Relief Committee through the CNIB. In 1954, 21 survivors were receiving pensions. A company known as the Canadian Free Library for the Blind used to send Braille books for free to anyone in Canada. After the explosion, they rallied together to raise money, and by 1918, a year later, they became the Canadian Institute for the Blind, known as the CNIB that we know today. The CNIB's motto is actually inspired by Halifax. It is, "Seeing beyond vision, lost since 1918. So who was at fault? Charles Burchell, the lawyer of the emo, blamed 3 men: the captain of the Mont Blanc, the harbor pilot that day, and the naval officer in charge of the harbor. On February 4th, 1918, 2 months later, a judge found the Mont Blanc fully responsible. The 3 men were arrested and charged with manslaughter. Although many, and I mean many, attempts were made, charges did not stand as lack of evidence was cited. In 1919, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled both parties, the emo and the Mont Blanc, were both responsible. Ultimately, no one was ever charged. The captain of the Mont Blanc returned to France and continued his career as a mariner. The naval officer in charge of the harbor that day was sent to another location, and the Halifax harbor pilot, he stayed, and despite having many difficulties from people in town. In the end, what we learned from this disaster was better preparation and planning was needed, and not just in Halifax or Nova Scotia, but in Canada and everywhere. Stricter maritime laws regarding cargo ID and harbor control were enforced. It was studied by those developing the atomic bomb to understand the effects of the blast. The collision was used by Navy as an example of what not to do in training. It is the first time local civilians had to coordinate and deal with mass casualties all at once. Many advances in ophthalmology and pediatric surgeries came about in this time of need. As a token of gratitude for Massachusetts relief efforts after the blast, a Christmas tree cut from the local forest is delivered every year since 1971. Well, that was a history lesson and a half. I hope you enjoyed my second podcast here at Nothing Ever Happens in Canada. Thanks for listening. I'm Canadian Girl. Once again, I'd like to thank Anchor. It's just such an amazing app. And with all the help it provides, I've been able to do so much. So thanks again. I do want to recommend a podcast that's a little off topic, but one that I cannot stop listening to. And if you're an unsolved crime fan like me, you'll absolutely love it. Somebody Knows Something by CBC Podcasts. There's about 4 seasons, and I think they're on the 5th one right now doing research, so it should be out by the end of the year. You can find it wherever you listen to your podcast, but if not, I've linked it down below. Thanks so much for listening to the very, very end. I really do appreciate it. It means so much to me. I am new to the podcasting world, so if you have any tips or comments, please let me know at canadiangirl2319@gmail.com. Again, it's canadiangirl2319@gmail.com. I'm Canadian Girl. Until next time. We have a support button now. If you want to help this podcast out because you think it's rad, follow the first link in the show notes below. The rest is up to you. If you want to help in an even bigger way, you can do that by leaving a shiny 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you can't do that, like or comment on your podcast app if that's available. All these little things help this podcast move around in the podcast charts so we can meet more awesome fans like you. And if you don't know what to say, just say hi. I'll say hi right back.